The word Air invokes certain ideas. It's light, wispy, weightless, and it is the perfect name for what Apple introduced way back in 2008 with the MacBook Air. This radically redesigned device that fit in an envelope was something we had never seen, and it set the stage for the laptop lineup for the next decade. So when Apple introduces a brand new computer using that name, it invokes those thoughts. But the question is, does this computer live up to that? Or has Apple forgotten what Air actually means? After using the MacBook Air for about a month, I've finally come to the opinion that this is kind of the best default computer that Apple has ever made. It hits all the categories that I think are the most important and that most people would actually care about. Now, in the last few weeks, there has been some, I guess you'd say, controversy about this computer, specifically the M2 chip inside. This is the update from the M1 that we got before in the previous MacBook Air. And while I'll say that the M2 for me hasn't given me any issues whatsoever, it's plenty fast, I haven't noticed thermal throttling in the work that I was doing, and really, I've just never thought about the processor because it just does everything I need it to do, I can also see some of the arguments of why the M2 chip is a bit of a disappointment. I feel like Apple almost set themselves up for failure with the M2 chip because in the M series, when they released the M1, then the M1 Pro and Max and the Ultra, they were always upping the level what these chips could do, so it made it feel as though the next generation, the M2, would make that same leap, and it just didn't really do that. This is still basically an M1 chip with a little bit more horsepower behind it. It's not a bad thing in any way, it just feels strange compared to what Apple was doing with the M1 chip itself. And I think that's where some of the controversy comes from. It just wasn't the update a lot of us were maybe hoping for. And I definitely see and understand that feeling. But on the other hand, when I'm using this laptop, I'm not treating it as if it's a MacBook Pro or, an M1 Ultra inside. No, this is a MacBook Air and I'm using it as a MacBook Air. So that means I'm not really trying to do extensive editing. It's not my main computer. I'm not rendering things. I'm not doing super intensive tasks. This is my computer that I use for document editing, watching content, answering emails, surfing the web, pretty much the life of a student or an office worker. I think this computer works perfectly for. And that's how I've been using this computer because I know it's not meant to be a MacBook Pro. That's why they make that computer instead. Although if you need to, it can dabble in those areas of more intensive tasks. It's clearly not made to do that. Now, power and M2 aside, I think the rest of this computer is a home run. I absolutely love it. It is thin and lightweight, although I will say it was heavier than I thought it was going to be when I picked it up out of the box for the first time. But after, a few weeks, that doesn't really matter, neither here nor there. It's a thin, light computer, and the screen is excellent. Yes, the notch is here, but I'm used to that since I have a MacBook Pro. And I think anyone that buys this, it's going to be a non-issue. You get used to it very quickly, and you do get more screen real estate thanks to that notch. Sure, Apple could probably have done something different to not have a notch, but that's the direction they chose, and I'd rather have that than the thicker bezels and less screen real estate. So if that's the way Apple's going to do it, I'm happy that this is what we got. And the screen quality is great as usual. I never had issues with the previous MacBook Air, but it's still just as nice now. Those thinner bezels really do just make it look nicer, even though the screen quality, the only difference is it's a little brighter, but everything else is basically the same, but I think it's noticeable. I'm also glad MagSafe made a return here and that we still get 2 Thunderbolt ports. And when using it, the keyboard and trackpad are still good as ever. I had seen some people say that maybe it wasn't quite as good, maybe a little more flexible, a little more flimsy, cheap feeling, but I don't know, I didn't really notice that, especially when comparing to my MacBook Pro. But I think my favorite thing about this computer is kind of the same story as the M1 MacBook Air, and that's the battery life. It's excellent here. I didn't time it or anything, but I could take it off the MagSafe charger in the morning, use it all day again for the types of work that I was using it for, which is not anything super intensive, but I could use it all day and have no issues with it, especially if I lower the screen brightness a little bit. The battery life is great, but that's kind of where my opinions end for the MacBook Air as a product. It's a solid device that does everything really well. Yes, it has its quirks just like every other product out there, but I just use it every day and it works great. And I think anyone that does buy this computer is going to be very happy. But I don't know, I just can't help shake the feeling that this is not the original plan Apple had for this computer. Part of me just tells me this was not supposed to be the MacBook Air, but rather something else. Okay, bear with me here, I'm gonna lay this all out. Apple's naming scheme just doesn't make all that much sense anymore. The MacBook Air originally, when it was first announced, was supposed to be this radically thin and light computer that was something we had never seen before. And back when it was announced, that was definitely the case. When Steve Jobs took the MacBook Air out of that envelope, it was a wow moment. It was something we really had never seen before. And that's what that Air name provoked. It was light, thin, almost like air. It was making a statement. But these days, as that Air name has progressed and as we've gotten other products, the Air has evolved into the most affordable Mac, not the thinnest and lightest. Yes, maybe it is also thin and light, but that doesn't seem to be the point of the computer. It is more so that it is affordable. When Apple introduced their silicon and showed us just how much power they were able to get out of these chips, it was exciting. It showed us that there was more that could be done in this field than what we had from other companies before. And with each iteration of this chip, the M1 Pro, the M1 Max, the M1 Ultra, Apple just showed us how much of a jump they could make. And then you take that power and look at the new products they were introducing, like the 14 and 16-inch MacBook Pros, or even the radically thin 24-inch iMac, and it almost felt like Apple was finally liberated. They were in full control of everything they could do, which means they could make incredible products that were different than what we can get in the Intel days. I think that made a lot of people maybe misinterpret what the future possibilities were. So when Apple introduced this new MacBook Air, which is the first redesign with Apple Silicon, I think a lot of us were expecting a level of redesign similar to that 24-inch iMac or the 16 or 14-inch MacBook Pros, where they would take risks and really show what they could do with the product. And instead, it feels like we got kind of a phoned home design. In a lot of ways, I'm thinking that this is more so a MacBook rather than a MacBook Air, and there's a few reasons for that. The first kind of most obvious one is that MacBook Air is not written anywhere on this computer, which is a little strange. Every other computer has it somewhere. The MacBook Pros have it written engraved on the bottom. This has nothing. Or you can have it in the screen. There's nothing there either. There's no indication what this computer is unless you know, or if you go into the software. Not a big deal, but definitely interesting. And another reason is that this is a departure from what the MacBook Air design language has always been. Instead of it being that wedge shape, it's now basically a thinner version of the MacBook Pro. It has that squared off top with the rounded bottom. And that's why part of me thinks that the original plan for this computer was to introduce it as a MacBook, kind of the standard MacBook computer that you would get if you didn't need the portability or affordability of the MacBook Air, but also didn't need the power of a MacBook Pro. This is the perfect middle ground, which the MacBook is something they've usually always had. And instead, I think a lot of us were expecting this. Let me introduce you to the 12-inch MacBook back from 2015. This is a very old computer that was way ahead of its time. But when you think MacBook Air, especially MacBook Air in the time of Apple Silicon, I think this is what most of us had in mind. Something that is a radical departure from the Intel days. Super thin, super light, no fans, but also has great battery life and the power of the M2 chip. And just imagine this, but with the updated screen, add MagSafe, add an extra Thunderbolt port there. You basically have the ultimate MacBook Air. Now, obviously, we didn't get that, but it leads to the question of why. Why is this what we got as the MacBook Air rather than something a little bit more ambitious? Now, the answer to that is only something Apple knows. Maybe this is exactly the MacBook Air they were always wanting to make, and they could finally make it now that they have Apple Silicon. Maybe that's the case. But I think really where the issue comes in is the naming of the MacBook lineup across the board. So here's what Apple could do, I think, to make this line perfectly clear so that anyone that walks into the Apple Store or goes online knows exactly which computer they should buy. On the top end, keep the 14 and 16 MacBook Pro. They're excellent, they are killing it, and they make perfect sense. You want the Pro computers, you go to the very top. But in the middle, we kill the M2 MacBook Pro because, again, it doesn't make much sense, and instead we take the MacBook Air M2 and rename it the MacBook. This is the entry-level standard MacBook. It has the same basic design as the MacBook Pro, but it's thin and light and has the M2 processor built in. So this is most people's kind of entry points into the MacBook. And on the other end with the MacBook Air, there's two directions Apple could go. They could keep the MacBook Air as being the more affordable option at that $999 price point, and that makes sense, or they could kind of revisit the roots of what that word Air actually means and make a revitalized version of the 12-inch MacBook, something that is incredibly thin, incredibly light, but now has the power, the battery life that Apple Silicon can provide, and make a case for why the MacBook Air is a computer you'd want, rather than one you're going to settle for because of the price. And whether they went for the more affordable option with the MacBook Air or the more innovative option with the MacBook Air, it would then make the line completely clear. You have the MacBook Air, the MacBook, and the MacBook Pro. And this is not unprecedented. This is something they have done in the past with their lineup. They always had a MacBook and a MacBook Pro, but it's just confusing with the lineup they have now. And that's how I think they could fix it and make the laptop line from Apple make perfect sense for anyone needing a laptop. But this is really why this video took so long to get out, why it took over a month of me using it. The computer itself is very basic and just good. There's nothing really remarkable about it, and that's why I didn't have to talk about it all that much. But it took this long to just analyze what this computer was for. And I just can't help shake that feeling that Apple had better plans for the MacBook Air with the M2 chip, and things just didn't work out. And even with all this that I've just proposed, it doesn't take away the fact that the M2 MacBook Air I think is a great product. And if you're in the market for a computer like this is the first place to look. And if you do pick one up, I think you're going to be happy.